Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, wherever you're joining us today from around the globe. My name is Shamian Evans. I am the Minister for Women and Gender Justice with the National Ministries of UCC, and I want to welcome all of you into this space in the spirit of Nikki Giovanni's writing, who was a prolific poet and writer. She talked a lot about how it forms a sanctuary when Black women are seen, when they are affirmed, when they are recognized. She talked a lot really about how it starts with self first. But I think there's something to be said about what happens when there are communities like this and there are webinars like this where the flyer already sends out the welcome. It already does the affirming work. It already does the work of ensuring folks know that they are not alone in the struggle. In my mind, that's already a part of the healing work that has gone out even before a word is spoken. So it's in that spirit that I want to welcome each and every one of you to this important conversation. So this is the way that things will flow today. First, have some conversation about equity, really focusing in on racism as power to set the framework. Then dovetail into talking about how Black women are racialized, and then how exceptionalism emerges as a survival strategy because of that racialization. Talk about the ways in which faith communities, intentionally and unintentionally, can reinforce some of the myths that I'm going to be talking about today and this idea of exceptionalism. Also, how it shows up in justice work and burnout. And it's important that I include that, especially thinking about the time that we're living in right now and how we sustain ourselves for the journey. And then, of course, rounding out our time, talking about sustaining a resistance, really as an individual. How do we sustain ourselves for the marathon, right? So that we don't get burned out in a sprint. And it's nice, even though I can't really follow the chat that well, I am seeing some familiar names, and that certainly warms my heart. So I appreciate seeing some folks that I know. I see good friend Patty in the chat, and some refugees in the chat. Thank you for joining the conversation today. Now, before I continue, Patricia Hill Collins, a sociologist and a Black feminist theorist, has talked a lot about situated knowledge. Basically, that everything that we know, everything that we understand about something cannot be separated from our social location and historical location, right? So, for example, the fact that I'm giving this presentation in 2026 means inherently it's going to look very different than if I had lived in 1830s. Well, actually, that would be very, very, let me move it up a little bit, 1950s, right? And I was giving this presentation. Obviously, the content would be different because I'd be living in a different historical time. Additionally, all of my experiences, all of the things that I have learned, race, class, sexuality, gender, socioeconomic status, where I was raised, how traditions, et cetera, they all kind of form how we come to understand the world. Now, why is this important for this conversation? Let me first, actually, no, let me continue on that thought. It's important because if we're having a conversation about Black women, I am encouraging everyone in the space, especially those that aren't the subject of this particular webinar, perhaps are on the periphery or in the balcony, so to speak, to think about how your own social location, how the sum total of your experiences has shaped and informed your view of Black women, right? And I would encourage, no one's in your own mind, right? And so honesty is the first step in doing this kind of work. So if you're not honest with yourself, it's not going to go. It's not going to go very far. And for those that are the subject for Black women that have joined this conversation all along the spectrum to also think about what has shaped and informed your view about who you are in the world, because that's also important to this conversation, especially as we dive into the ways that some of the stereotypes can be internalized and that we can start to do our own gaslighting. So let's start off with my social location. And this is just bits of it. Of course, I'm not able to share everything about who I am, right, in this short amount of time. But I'm Black, which absolutely has some bearing on this conversation, as that my experiences obviously have shaped some of the information that I'm bringing to you today and how I've come to understand myself, especially in the West. And what I mean by that, especially in the United States, that has a particular kind of racialized system. I'm also genderqueer. So that means that my sex assigned at birth is female, but that I blend the lines of masculinity and femininity. That is important to this conversation because I can be rendered inside and both outside at the same time. There are certain circles of Black women that do not want to have me join the conversation because of my queer identity. Right? There's also a way, sometimes in LGBTQ communities, where heteronormativity, that is heterosexuality, is kind of picked up and replicated. So I'm talking about all of these, not necessarily stereotypes, but the privileging around masculinity. Some of these things get kind of replayed. And so I can be in certain circles, and because I am masculine in queer settings, sometimes I find myself at the center of privilege, which I think warrants some interrogation. It's pretty interesting how sometimes we replicate these isms that we're trying to move away from. That also informs the way I approach this. I'm an institutional leader, so that means there's some parameters. I'm not just here talking to you from dinner table, right? I can't get too loose with it because I'm here as an employee of the National Ministries of UCC. So there's some parameters, even though UCC, of course, gives me a great deal of space and room. UCC has historically been on the front line of these kinds of conversations. I'm also a student with a background in race, sexuality, and gender that I bring. I'm living in the 21st century, as I mentioned, and then I have been shaped by Black women. So it's not just the women that I bring up throughout the course of this webinar, but I mean literally in my life. Broken around the age of 20. So I want you to picture that in your mind, right? Like kind of on the side of the sidewalk, broken. When I think about the people that have come along, that have lifted me up, there have been people from all backgrounds, communities, but the folks that sat with me, that dusted me off, that reminded me of the power in my legs, that gave me water when I was thirsty, it has always been Black women. Black women have been the salve, right, to my wounds. They've been the folks that have reminded me that I can stretch out my wings and fly. And the time that they've been clipped and I made some mistakes and I've fallen back down, it's always been in the arms of Black women. And when I was thinking about that, I'm a student at Union Theological, and the professor asked, what is your name? Who are the people that have uplifted you? I realized that on the paper, I had just listed Black women. And so that certainly shapes and informs my view of Black womanhood in the world. So having that said, I took time there because I do want to invite you to sink in to your own social location and sit there with it as we continue this conversation, because it's not just what I'm saying, but there is a methodology for the way that I'm engaging in this conversation. And I want folks to see how it feels with them. If you feel disrupted, why? If you're wondering, do I belong here? Why? Right? I want you to sit with those things. So let's dive in. Racism as a system. What do I mean? I'm not talking necessarily just about prejudice, not just about interpersonal bias, but a full system of power that structures access, safety, and belonging. And here I have, you'll see all along here, I'll have pictures of thinkers that I'm engaging with for this conversation that serve kind of to undergird to a foundation for what I'm saying, but also as a signpost in case you want to learn more about any of what I'm talking about. I've got them right here on the page. So feel free to explore and do some reading, right? So great thinkers like Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Angela Davis have talked about these systems in different ways. Here are some examples. Prejudice would be a teacher assuming a Black girl is disruptive. Bias is the fact that she is disciplined more harshly than white peers. And then the full system of power that criminalizes her hair, curriculum that excludes her history, school policing that disproportionately targets Black students, gifted programs that rely on bias testing that only privilege one way of learning. That would be an example, system of power. Here's another, I just have one more after this. This is more about the workplace, right? Prejudice would be, she seems too aggressive. And I put that one up there on purpose. Here I'm not talking about people throwing around stuff. I'm talking about the way in which Black women, for any expression of anger, right, healthy expression, can be rendered aggressive automatically. There's some prejudice in there because there are other groups of folks where it's seen as being expressive, passionate, right? Prejudice. She seems too aggressive in this example. The interpersonal bias, she's interrupted more in meetings. See this all the time. Her ideas are ignored until repeated, the same thing, repeated by someone else. She receives feedback about tone, but not about competence. Systems of power, leadership standards are built around white male norms. Promotion criteria rewards self-promotion, visibility. Professionalism is defined through respectability politics. HR protects the institution over the employee. That one's a little bit more complex, but it still warrants being in here. And there are no Black women in senior leadership. The final example that I'll offer, prejudice. Women shouldn't preach. Interpersonal bias, Black women being constantly praised for service, but never invited to have a seat at the senior leadership table, or any leadership table for that matter. System would be denominations that historically exclude or have excluded women from any leadership position, from preaching, from doing anything that's sort of visible leadership, that's not sort of in the background. Theological language that centers male imagery. Leadership pipelines that just replicate existing power so it stays along the same sort of line. There's no entry point for women. And financial control that sits with boards dominated by men. Those are some examples of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about systems that are racialized. So it's important to think about, and I have Toni Morrison's quote up here. Definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. I'm going to invite some folks, I do have the chat up here. What does she mean by this, do you think? What did she mean when she wrote this in Beloved? Definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. I'm going to pause here to see if anybody, hey Ursula, let's see if anybody populate anything in the chat here. Now don't leave me hanging, y'all. Somebody please put something in there. Definitions belong to the definers, not the defined, okay? White people controlling the narrative, others controlling the narrative. That we have the agency to define who we are, meaning that those that have the power to name do so and dictate who others are. Yes. We do not have to answer to the names we are called. Being tied to fatalism from disrespect. Yes. So folks, you're walking with me, right? That Definitions belong to the definers, those typically that are in power, as I'm seeing a lot of people put, hey, Cheryl, a lot of people, hey, Pastor Ann. Okay, I need to focus. I'm just seeing community in here, and it's just warming my heart. That definitions belong to the definers, typically those that are in power, but not the defined, especially because oftentimes it's being used to do some work, right? It's always important to think about who controls the narrative, who sets the standard, who benefits. So now that I've introduced the framework, let's talk a bit about Black women, right? Through the framework of Moya Bailey and Kimberly Crenshaw, Moya Bailey has done a lot of work around racialized misogyny, especially about how Black women are depicted in digital media. Kimberly Crenshaw has done a lot of work around intersectional invisibility. And I'll have some resources from both of them at the end of this. During a 2016 TED Talk, Kimberly Crenshaw said, if you see inequality as a Black problem or a women's problem, then you completely miss what's happening to Black women. That is really, really important. Because there is a particular kind of racialized misogyny that is directed exactly about at Black women, right? And sometimes narratives get absorbed into Black problem, women's problem. Let me highlight this to really illustrate what it is that I'm saying here. For example, the myth of the strong Black woman is unique to Black womanhood. Black women, and if you think even in social media, think about movies, think about characters, think about stereotypical ones, and maybe ones that you have not interrogated as stereotypical. Black women historically have been cast as emotionally indestructible, right? Related to that, any emotion can be considered emotionally excessive. So if you're angry, automatically aggressive, right? If depending on the way your hair looks, the way you're dressing, the way you carry yourself, there's so many things that you can kind of not do so well, and then you're rendered immediately as unfeminine, right? That's not appropriate. You're having a good time, you're out. For some people, that's what it's seen. Oh, they're just having a good time over there at that table. But for Black women historically, oh, you're too loud. You need to reel it in, right? So this idea of Black women as emotionally indestructible also in some ways means that there is sort of cast as having no emotion, not being able to share any emotion whatsoever. Cultural narratives frame Black women as naturally strong. Now, there's not, Black women are strong, don't get me wrong. But this idea that Black women are naturally strong kind of has an undercurrent to it that erases humanity, erases the fact that folks need to lean, that folks need support, that folks need a shoulder to cry on occasionally. So folks need some pouring into. This idea of Black women as being naturally strong erases, it can erase all of that. It also normalizes Black women's suffering. And so resilience can become expectation rather than recognition. It becomes normalized. Now, who do these racialized systems benefit? According to some of these thinkers that I'm bringing into the conversation, protects white femininity as being the norm. White femininity is cast as delicate, as worth protecting, as naturally pure, as soft, is essentially a standard of womanhood. So in this way, white womanhood becomes the default. Black womanhood becomes the deviation. It can also justify unequal treatment if Black women are perceived really as strong enough, as resilient, as naturally enduring, as really built for this. Then racialized systems can justify paying them less, promoting them less, supporting them less, protecting them less, and expecting more labor from them. It can extract labor without reciprocity. So racialized systems can rely on Black women, and I need you to walk with me here. Can rely on Black women for emotional labor, depend on them to hold organizations together, expect them to save churches, to save organizations, to save institutions, and to call on them in moments of crisis. Now, of course, as leaders, folks get called on. But what can happen under the trope of racialized systems is that it ends up being lopsided to the point at which folks are like, you need to call me for that? You all can figure this out, right? In a way in which Black women they are expected to bear the emotional labor that is connected to crises. It also can maintain a moral order so that instead of seeing any kind of concern as justifiable, it can be cast off by just saying, you know what, she's a little emotional today. And then, and this is really, I can't think of the word I'm trying to use here, but part of the way that systems, racialized systems are set up is to fracture solidarity. If people are fractured, then you can have power. You don't want people coming together. You don't want people joining together in community because then folks will realize their own power. Systems benefit when marginalized groups are fractured. So pitting Black men against Black women, white women against Black women. And then inside of communities, and I think this is probably among the most painful, in our own communities, not being willing to connect with one another, not coming together across perceived divides. And so that Black womanhood itself can be completely fractured, right? So how, under this framework, I have to look at the time because I'm just talking. How under this framework then does exceptionalism emerge as survival? Now, do folks know what I mean when I say exceptionalism? Folks know what I'm talking about. What is exceptionalism? Okay. Someone just put yes. I love that. Very straightforward answer, yes. Okay, un-American, exceptionalism. Okay, someone just said, please explain. Great, great. So when I say exceptionalism, I'm talking about this idea that folks have heard this idea that we have to work twice as hard, right, to get ahead. We have to be extraordinary. We have to go above and beyond. And so exceptionalism is thinking about where the standard is, right? The standard is for most folks, and then having to excel that in all ways, all the time. Have to be better, have to work longer, have to work harder, have to be super competent, right? There's a way in which exceptionalism can be draining, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in this context, I'm talking about it as a tool of survival for a lot of Black women. Someone said when we have to be 10 times better, more educated, more qualified than whatever the standards are for others, exactly that. Twice as good for half the recognition, exactly that. Having to be exceptionally excellent at everything you do in order to be accepted, exactly that. So I propose that there is a loop here, and this is not Black womanhood's issue to deal with, right? But we have stereotypes, we have controlling images that position Black women as emotionally indestructible, like I said, naturally strong, endlessly capable. So in this way, it's imposed. Then we have institutions that fail to protect them, that are reinforcing these stereotypes. So we have failure. So under these conditions, hypercompetence and strength become adaptive, becomes a way to survive, have to be better, have to do more, have to know more in order to adapt to these racialized systems. And then this is where it goes really wrong. It's already wrong from the beginning. But then what happens, and this can happen outside of our communities, within our communities, that adaptation gets misread as natural capacity. So it's not seen as a response to the stereotypes. It's not seen as a response to the failure of institutions, right? It's seen as, you know what, Black women just got it, just strong, right? Can handle anything and everything. It becomes normalized. And then it's reinforced, right? Goes back up. Stereotypes, institutional failure, hypercompetence as a survival strategy, and then it's just normal. This is just how Black women operate, right? Now, of course, I want to say that I'm not speaking for all of Black women, and that my perceptions are heavily influenced by the West, right? So this is not Black women are different across the globe, across the nation. But what I am saying does speak to some things that have been heavily studied, heavily experienced, heavily lived out. Right? This is where the loop continues. So the breaking of this loop does not sit with Black womanhood. It sits with institutions. And so this is why sometimes there is an issue. DEI work is fantastic. Do the work, read the books, right? Right? Have the conversations. But if somehow it does not change the organization, it does not change the spiritual community, it does not change the church's system, then these things get reinforced. The work it begins with the people, but it has to seep into the culture. It has to seep into the system in order for there to be real change. Now, part of what I'm focusing on here, though, is this idea of it getting normalized and how, as Black women, genderqueer women like myself included, what we do to sustain ourselves under these institutions. So exceptionalism as survival is a response to ongoing structural scrutiny. So what does it look like? I've been talking about exceptionalism. Here are just some things, and I'm sure that you all have some others that you can populate. Strength becomes expectation. So exceptionalism means that there's no fragility, especially in public, right? And there's no public failure. It's simply not an option to fail publicly. Hypercompetence becomes protection, having to know more, having to do more, having to learn more, having to stay longer. Even Andrea, who is part of I'm just going to say the lead on the back end for this kind of work. We were having a conversation earlier, and she asked me about the music that I uploaded. And she said, there's legalities. And I said, oh, I've already done the work, right? I already know this is license free, right? Everything that I included in here, I went the extra mile. I made sure the pictures were public domain, right? Why? Because I'm used to what it feels like when you're both hyper visible and rendered invisible at the same time, right? The spotlight is always on in some ways. So hypercompetence, doing more than what is really required, becomes protection. Emotional containment as safety. This is a really big one here. When racialized systems say that when Black women are angry, that they're automatically aggressive, when there's emotions like sadness, for some people, it's considered a sign that folks may just be having a rough time, right? Sometimes for Black women in racialized systems, it's rendered as unstable. Someone shares frustration. Sometimes it's seen as legitimate. It's a legitimate thing to bring to the table. But for Black women, sometimes it can just be rendered unprofessional. You're being too hard. So there are some ways, even, right, when I've had conversations with other Black women, where even the body stops moving, right? That the hands stop moving. Why? And just the lips are moving, just talking like this. Why? Because for under racialized systems, any emotion, even what I'm doing now with my hands, you can see me in the corner, can be weaponized. Think about that. That's wild, but it's true. So exceptionalism means containing emotion for safety. Being exceptional becomes a strategy for belonging because, and someone said this in the chat, in racialized systems, belonging is often not granted, it's earned repeatedly. You hit the mark, and then you're expected to hit the mark again. And then you're expected to hit the mark again, right? That's what it looks like. Now, the cost, and I'm sure some of you can populate, somebody already said something about stress and unhealed nervous systems. There is a cost associated with this idea that Black women are just strong all the time, just indestructible, right? And with exceptionalism coming up as a response. Now I'm using here, I'm going to invoke Tamara. The only reason I'm not saying her last name is that I don't want to mispronounce it, who has done a lot of work on the myth of the strong Black woman, and also Walker Barnes, who's also done similar work, but from a theological and psychological standpoint to really talk about the cost of exceptionalism as survival on Black women. Strength can become compulsory. It can become a mask that is not removed in any situation, right? Where strength becomes part of identity. So you're working inside of institutions, but also at your home. You're just strong. You got it. Right? Over-functioning in faith in organizational spaces. And then oftentimes, I think a lot of us are aware of how Black women in leadership especially, and even not in leadership actually, I take that back. Black women in spaces can be completely burned out because of trying to hold things together. Emotional suppression is rewarded so that it becomes both inside and out of the community. Sometimes in Black communities, not all Black communities, being able to hold it together, being able to be strong, to grin and bear it, can invite some pats on the back. Yeah, she's got it, she's holding, you got it together, right? Emotional suppression, rewarded. And then this invites these experts talk about that it causes disconnection from the body, which leads, if you look at some of the research out there, Black women, there's a lot going on with health and well-being that's connected to stress, that's connected to not having outlets, right, to talk about and deal with the emotions of living under racialized systems. Also with exceptionalism, vulnerability is penalized. You don't talk about vulnerability just isn't on the table, right? Why? There's the reasons, right? Vulnerability can be weaponized, but if you don't have any spaces where you can kick off your shoes, you don't have any spaces where you can let down your hair if you have hair, then that also can be detrimental. And under the trope of exceptionalism, vulnerability just isn't part of the conversation. And then support isn't sought. Walker Barnes talks about the fact that sometimes under the weight of the myth of the strong Black woman, that depression can go completely undetected because it is not seen as something that is to be praised or valued, to go out and to say, I need some support, I need some help. Right? Now, before I get into, how am I doing with time? Oh, I'm doing okay. Okay, before I get into some things about how we can address some of these things in terms of as an individual, not necessarily institutions, and I'll have something to say about that in a second. Let's talk about where faith comes in and sometimes can reinforce some of these stereotypes. Now, I'm sure some of you, and hopefully not in your current, if you are part of a spiritual community, have heard some of these things where theology can be weaponized and sacrifice can be framed as spiritual maturity. Now, here I'm not talking about the cost associated with doing the work, right? Everything, there is a cost, time, energy, labor, right? But when folks are asking you to be spent, to say you sacrifice your whole self, and that is how you get closer to the divine, that's problematic. Sometimes faith spaces can talk about suffering as redemptive, that the more that you're suffering, the more holy you become. Self-denial is elevated over self-preservation. So you don't think about the self, you remove the self entirely in the work of justice, but sometimes this can also be weaponized. It can be weaponized and can be harmful to say that you just give over of yourself until you're spent without any thought about how we pour back into ourselves. Exhaustion can be praised as devotion. You're doing the long walk. You're carrying the cross in some communities. And so instead of it being a marker to say, we need to see what's happening here, right? We need to see about ways we can fill ourselves up. It's sometimes just reinforced theologically as devotion. And then silence, sometimes submission, depending on faith community, can be mistaken for humility. These are some ways, intentionally, let's be clear, sometimes it's intentional for control, for hierarchy, right? And sometimes unintentionally because of the theological background that folks come from. There's a way in which this idea that's connected to some of the themes that I've illuminated here can be reinforced. Connected to that justice work, when we think about the time we're living in, such a time as this, sometimes movement culture, of course, urgency is important in any movement, but then speed becomes virtue so that there's no way to take a breath. It's kind of akin to running a marathon, but being asked to sprint the entire time. Exhaustion then becomes faithfulness for the work. It becomes a badge of honor. And it's interesting how it plays out more with Black women. It was Alicia Garza. I was reading something that she wrote a little while ago, and she said that she was completely burned out at some point from doing the work that she had been doing. And interestingly enough, the Black Lives Matter movement was born out of rest. It was born out of a time when she said, I need to take pause. I need to take breath. That is when the Black Lives Matter movement was born. Something to think about. So let's talk about some disruption and talk about pouring back into ourselves. There is some womanist. If you're not familiar with womanism, I would encourage you to grab a book, to dive in. It centers the experiences of Black women. And I have two folks here, Katie Geneva Cannon, who was a womanist theologian and ethicist, and Kelly Brown Douglas, who is a womanist theologian and Episcopal priest, who have done a great deal of work, especially around faith communities and some of the things that I have uplifted. And their work is clearly disruptive, that there shouldn't be a glorification of martyrdom, especially for Black female leaders, where that happens quite a bit, that if you're leading, then you give again. You give all of yourself with no regard to pouring back in. They also disrupt this idea that suffering is inherently redemptive. They argue against that, and they say suffering without justice does not work. Right? That God just doesn't want to see people suffering. It doesn't make folks more holy. It doesn't make sure that you have, a seat at the table. That it needs to be interrogated. And then challenges the moral superiority of self-erasure by frankly saying that it's not right, that God is not asking, the divine is not asking for folks to be completely erased, and the assumption that holiness requires depletion. Now, Cannon, as an ethicist, also argues against this idea of purity, morality, that can be devoid of thinking about race, gender, class, right? Thinking about the circumstances that people are in. Right, so I think about, for example, Hurricane Katrina, and when the levees broke and the resources were blocked, there were images of folks stealing food. Right now, imagine folks don't have any food; they don't have any access to resource, but certain people were depicted as thugs, right? Now, bringing this into some of Cannon's work is like this idea of morality, of what's good in God's eyes, cannot be separated from people's experiences, that you have to bring in everything. Now, I'm kind of going off a little bit because I'm still kind of in the lane, but I'm talking a little bit more because I realize I'm passionate about this. And so the last thing I'll say is that Douglas also goes so far as to say that white supremacy is not just political, it's also a theological construct. It also provides a theological framework. And what she argues is that when you think about who is worth saving, right? Uh, we're not always talking about black folks in that, right? And how even hierarchy and some other things get replicated in predominantly black churches. She argues that white supremacy has some foundation there. I would encourage some of her readings, which come up at the end here. How much? Okay, good. 15 minutes. Great. So let's make the turn. And we've already kind of made the turn, but we're going to make it all the way to the end here as a wrap up in the 15 minutes. Sustaining resistance. Now, I was watching Belonging on a flight that I was on recently. Not Belonging, Becoming, with Michelle Obama. And she was talking with a group of young black girls. They probably don't want to be called black young adults, women. And one of them asked her about what it was like, and I'm paraphrasing, to be like a black woman, presidency, or like the first lady, and like if she ever was like felt unseen, and she said to them, she said, don't wait to be seen, don't wait for these institutions to change. If you're waiting on equality, she said, one president, one vote, one good thing is not going to change the entire system, that you have to do it yourself. You just have to show up in a room and know that you belong, right? You have to show up and know that you're visible, know that you're seen. And she talked about how the people that raised her poured into her. She should always feel seen in whatever room that she walks into. It's in that spirit that I'm offering this sustaining resistance. The fight against institutional racism will continue. We will continue that work. But how do we sustain ourselves for such a time as this? Okay. I'm drawing here from Walker Barnes. She talks about anger as sacred signal. So she acknowledges the double bind, that you can't say anything. You may not be able to express anger in certain places without it being wielded and weaponized against you, right? But also can't hold it in because it can lead to other things. She encourages that instead to use anger as data and the importance of finding safe containers. So not just holding on to it, releasing it, finding safe containers. Like for me, I put it into my work, right? I have a great therapist. I'm a big proponent. So that's another conversation to have about therapy. Anyway, I'll leave that there. But she talks about therapy. She talks about the importance of trusted relationships. She talks about getting spiritual direction. She talks about looking for spaces where Black women can be emotionally honest. So moving away from allowing these stereotypes basically to narrate how we process emotion, right? That there needs to be released. She talks a lot about boundaries as spiritual practice, as a theology, right? As a praxis, that boundaries are not only healthy, right? That they're God-given. So the idea of saying, no, I'm doing things. Now, of course, there's some privilege. I understand that everybody can't, we're in different situations in our lives, but there's a way in which we all can have some boundaries that kind of go against the stereotypes that would have some of us just saying yes, 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 right? Hypercompetence, hyper functioning as survival. She talks about emotional honesty and self-compassion as liberation, that God is not glorified by our depletion. So being honest with the emotions that come up, to work through them, and not to gaslight ourselves, because again, these stereotypes can become internalized so that we are not allowing ourselves to feel emotion. We're telling ourselves, oh, maybe I'm thinking too much about it. Maybe I'm being too overboard about it. But we're living under the weight of racialized systems. So self-compassion as liberation is something else that she uplifts. And then finally, Tricia Hersey talks about rest is resistance. Now, Tricia was introduced to me, Hersey was introduced to me through UCC, so part of our larger departmental gatherings. They talk about the NAP ministry, and we actually pull from, I don't know if you can, probably you can't see, I'm holding this up, we pull from the rest deck at the end of our time together, and everybody sort of reads something. And I think this is incredibly rich resource especially for Black women, where she does a lot of work here. She posits rest as spiritual and political practice. And so it doesn't matter, again, I understand there's privilege. Not everybody can take a sabbatical, right? Now everybody can take a few days off. Now everybody can travel, right? But she writes in such a way that every person can find moments, even micro, small rest practices, where there is a reclaiming of the body. She talks about rest as boundary. She talks about collective rest. And if you go on her website, there's actually a picture. Her website is triciahersey.com. It's here on the screen on the left underneath her photo. There's a picture of her. And at first I thought, is she at a gym? Are they stretching? What's going on? I didn't realize she was at Emory leading a class. She's literally there in front of the class. She's on her stomach. She's laid out. She doesn't have any shoes on, right? And she's leading a course. Amazing to even think about. These are some things that we don't even consider as a possibility. Right? So collective rest, actually having gatherings where you talk about, where you embody rest as reclamation. She talks a lot about undoing grind theology that dictates, it says that we have to go, and doing our best. Now, again, some of these things, especially working within racialized institutions, we aren't given the opportunity, right, to pause. But she's challenging us to push back, and then dreaming as resistance, literally dreaming as resistance, and then shifting the language. That this is not self-care, this is reparation. This is not recovery, it is refusal. That is so incredibly powerful. I see some people have written in the chat that are familiar with it. So before I'm going to put 2 quotes on the screen, but before I do that, I want to invite others really quickly to name the ways that they find rest. How do you all, in your various roles, sustain resistance under trying conditions, right? What are some other things? I've talked with some Black women, and on a very foundational level, I'm talking about, some folks talk about, they dance, right? They read a book. They give themselves permission to completely and totally unplug. What are some ways that you find that you find breath that goes against some of the things we've talked about in terms of the myth of the strong Black women, in terms of exceptionalism, in terms of burnout? What are some things that you do? Okay. Meditation. I take a full break, drink an entire cup of tea. I like to rest by reading, journaling, and music dance parties. Retire. Hope to get there someday. I intentionally nap on the afternoons. I play jazz music. I drink a great glass of red Zen. I connect with sisterhood. I journal. Permission to do absolutely nothing. Routine stretch and massage therapy. So after this, I am doing nothing. There are some things that I have to do, and that will wait. What I'm going to do, and this is for me, I'm going to grab a glass of champagne. Shamian is. I'm not telling people to go out there and drink. I don't want anybody to say Shamian said, right? And I'm going to play video games, because that is the way that I unplug, and I'm giving myself permission to take breath, right? I dance. I do other things, but I'm also a work in progress, and I'm trying to find moments to undo some of the things that I've been taught, right, about what I need to do. Okay? Some people are sharing some other books in the chat, which is great. Please do share. I'm bringing the chitlins to the table because I like chitlins, right? Some other people might like neck bones. Some folks have the mac and cheese. Somebody has the okra, the Kool-Aid. So if there's some things that work for you to undo this idea of exceptionalism that helps you to sustain, please do share those in the chat. And there's a resource list that's coming right after this. Look at this, right on time. It's great. I want to leave you with these two quotes. The next slide after these quotes is going to be a full list of resources that lists the folks that I have mentioned throughout. I think there's 7, 8 people. Some books. There's a mixture too, so that it's accessible. So there's some books. There's TED Talk. There's some articles. I would encourage some reading, right? Especially in light of this idea of self-preservation. So here are the 2 quotes I'm going to leave with you. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It's not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And that is an act in and of itself, I'm adding a little bit, of political warfare. Audre Lorde. And then I've got to leave on a resistance angle. Nikki Giovanni wrote, if we can't have ham, we boil, I call them chitlins. If we're given rotten peaches, we make cobbler. If given scraps, we make quilts. If you take away our drums, we clap with our hands. We're a resilient people. We prove the human spirit will prevail. So having that said, I'm going to leave you all. There's some outro music. The next slide is going to have some resources. But as we continue, when we think about what is happening around the nation today, I think it's really, really important in the light of what has been shared that Black women in particular find ways to sustain resistance, because we are no good in a 26-mile marathon if we burn out at mile 10. And sometimes, because of racialized systems and that have become normalized, there is a great burden to carry sometimes that is disproportionately placed on the shoulders of Black women. And because Black women rise, it becomes normalized. There's some interrogation that needs to happen there, right? So I talked about that a little bit, but here I want to end on the self-interrogation, some ways that you find to stop and grab water during the marathon, right? You stop and slow down, maybe tie the shoes, you know what I mean? Maybe wipe the sweat from the brow, because if you don't make it to the end, the work, right? The work is there regardless. We have to be sustained in order to continue to pass the torch. So having that said, I'm leaving you with resources. Thank you all for joining me today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be a part of this important conversation around racializing Black women, equity, exceptionalism, and sustaining resistance.